Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video we'll be continuing our Roblox Tycoon game, but this time focusing on leader stats and taking a look how we can use those to store the money that our droppers are producing. So let's get into it. So where are we in our current Tycoon? Well, we've got a button. We can stand on the button to create a dropper. The dropper generates a block every so often, which then hits this seller. And right now, that's it. Nothing else happens. So what we should focus on first is making this seller item right here actually destroy these blocks and assign us some money. So how would we do that? Well, we can continue the sort of pattern that we've used throughout this game by adding a brand new script to our server script service. And this time we will call the script, we rename it here, we will call it sellers. Very original. And what is this going to do? Well, much like how our button script controls all the buttons, our seller script will control all the sellers. So right now we only have one, but you can imagine in this game we're going to end up with multiple factories because it's going to be a multiplayer game. And for each factory, we don't want a copy of this script in case we decide to change it later. So we're just going to have one that uses the collection service to control them all. So I've copied here the buttons script because we're going to be using a very similar pattern. But instead of a buttons model, we'll just go through and update each part. We'll have a seller model, which right now isn't even going to be a model, but that's okay. If we look at our seller, it's literally just a part. So that's fine. The tag we will use is a seller tag. And instead of having a collection of buttons, we'll have a collection of sellers. Pretty straightforward. And because we refactored the script earlier, we don't need to update these tags at the bottom here because they are all coming from this variable that we already updated. So one thing we do need to make sure we do is tag our seller. This was a problem we had with droppers before. We forgot to actually tag it. So let's do that right now. We can add the seller tag. And now the collection service, when it runs, will find all the things tagged as sellers. Right now there's only one. And we will start running this function when they get added or this function when they get removed. So let's just update these things. We don't have a button anymore. We have a list of sellers. And that sellers is the same thing that we want to disconnect our touch event from. And we don't actually need to hide or show anything. So this is going to be cool. When the collection service detects that a new seller has been added, or it finds one that's already in the world, it's going to run this on added. And much like our button, we need to hook up a touched event. Now this object is going to be a seller model, not a button model, which means we don't actually have a face on this object because that was our button. You can see here we have the touched event directly because the seller is itself a part that can be touched. So there we go. That's all the change that need to be made there. We just add the touch event directly to the object and we connect so that we can listen to it with this function that will pass into our touched handler the actual seller that got touched and the other part that touched it. And we should probably go ahead and change these other places that say button model because this script is not handling buttons anymore. But it's pretty easy to do that. We can change that to seller. And with that, we now have this script right here that should do something when a part touches it. Hooray! We made some money, buddy. Right? So now when that seller gets touched, we should see a print message in the output window. So let's take a look. We start the game, we buy this dropper, and we wait until the dropper drops something onto our little yellow platform here. And yep, you see, it did actually work. Now, what you'll notice here, though, is that much like with all kinds of touched events, it doesn't just happen once per thing touching it. It happens a whole bunch, especially as they bounce around and they sort of move up and down. So you do have to be careful with touched events. And normally what you would do, but we haven't yet shown that, is debounce these events, which is basically a technique for saying, I only want this event to fire once. And if it fires like 7 times all in quick succession, just ignore those other 6 and only tell me about it once. We're not going to do that right here. We'll probably come back to it at some other time, because what we're going to do instead is just completely get rid of that thing that touched us. So we can go other part dot destroy. And what you're going to see here is when a dropper product, I guess, the block that gets dropped, lands on this seller, it should disappear. And we can use that same function that when it disappears, there you go, it's going to assign us money. But we have nowhere to put that money yet. So let's figure that out. But first, I'm going to show you something funny. Our touched event just says whatever is touching it get destroyed, which means if I go and stand on this, I'm also going to get destroyed, which is probably not what you want. Maybe you do, depending on the type of game you have. Maybe it's like a spike pit or something. But for us, we need to make sure that this other part that is touching it and then assigning us money, I'll just add that here so that we remember it, give some money, is the actual product being sold. We don't want to assign money if someone just walks on it. We don't want to assign money if someone throws something on it. So we need to do some check here to make sure this other part that is hitting our seller is a block that we expect. And there's a pretty easy way to do this. I'm sure there's other ways of doing it too. But what you can do is on the item inside the dropper, this function drops the actual block. What we can do is add a tag to that item, and we'll call this a product. So now the item being dropped is going to have a tag called product. And if we go back to our sellers, what we can do is check that that other part has a tag on it called product. And if it does not have a tag on it called product, then we will just quit the function early. We will return, right? So if now I walk on this part, it's going to say, okay, BiteWeasel has hit this. Does BiteWeasel have the tag product? No, then quit out of the function early. But anything that does have the tag product will not go into this if statement, which means it should hit this. So now let's double check. We can start producing some items, but if I walk on this, I shouldn't die because I don't have that tag. But when that hits it, it does get destroyed. And in a second, assign us some money. Okay, pretty straightforward. We're using tags. We're updating some of the code that we had before, which you can see in the previous videos. And we've got it working. So now let's do this part. Give us some money. So what can we do to store money for each player? Well, as with most coding, there's a million different ways to do it. But one of the easiest ways that sort of Roblox gives you a built-in way of doing it is with leaderstats. So if you've ever joined a Roblox game before, you probably notice in the top right corner, there is a leaderboard with each player's name, and they have some sort of score associated with that. In Tycoons, that's usually the money or cash or whatever they call it, sort of value that each player has. And we can use that same system in our code here. Now, the first thing that we're going to need is a script to handle global things like that. Global things like players joining the game, assigning them a factory, making sure that they have leader stats, all of that stuff. We don't want to pollute our buttons, droppers, or seller script. It's nice that each one of those just controls the one thing it's talking about. So let's make a brand new script, and we can call it something else. So let's rename it. Let's just call it factories. I don't know if that's a good name. We might come back to it later. Essentially, this is going to be our main script that controls people joining the game and people leaving the game and sort of those concepts around assigning a factory and things like that, which we will get into. But first, we need some way of knowing that a player has joined the game so that we can assign them 0 money in case they've never joined before. And later on, we can sort of load that money from our database, our storage, so that if they play the game for a bit, leave, and then come back, they'll have that money stored. But we'll get to that in a later video. For now, let's figure out how to use leader stats. So first thing you're going to need is a reference to the players service. So local players equals game, get service, and then the players service. Now we could then add a hook into the players joining and the players leaving, but I, for one, can never remember what that actually looks like. I think it's player adding and player removing, right? So we could do that, and we can add one of these, and then you can go connect. So you see sometimes that function, the autofill function doesn't work, which is unfortunate, but you can always do it yourself. So here we go. Now we have a function that listens to when a player is added, and we want to add leader stats to the player. Come on. You must be able to do that, Roblox Studio. Yay, it did. So in this case, what it's sort of suggested is that we create a new folder instance called leader stats. We give it the right name, all in lowercase, and we assign that to, the parent to be the player. So what that means is inside your hierarchy, if you were to play this game now, when you join, there's actually a players service on the hierarchy here, and you can see yourself, and you'll see this new folder. That's basically what we've added. And inside this folder, we can start adding values, and they will appear magically on this scoreboard right here. So let's do that. So now we can say add a money number value to the leader stats. And that's what we'll do right here. Should be pretty straightforward. We'll create a new number value called money. We'll give it a name, money. We'll give it a value of 0, but we'll set the parent to be that folder we just saw. And when you do that, that becomes available in this leaderboard right here. So that's pretty much what this leader stats folder does. As long as you use the specialized name, which is all lowercase, leader stats, any value you put under here should appear on your scoreboard. I don't know if it works if you add it in the client. It's very interesting to find out. Yeah, it does. So there you go. So you can add anything here, but of course we're doing it via script. And it will appear on that leaderboard. So you don't have to call things money. You could call it coins. You could call it whatever. I guess it doesn't update its name very often, but you get the idea. So we're doing it via the script. Whenever a player joins, we create that new leader stats folder. And under that leader stats folder, we are creating a money number value. And we've set it to 0. Now this is good because what this means is that when we sell something, we'll be able to update this money value, and that should show in the scoreboard. So how do we do that? Well, we need a reference to the player that owns the factory that this seller happens to be within, right? So we're going to have to start thinking about the concept of who owns what factory, because eventually we're going to have a copy of this entire sort of set of items so that you can have a multiplayer game, right? Eventually we're going to do that. And now if this thing was to drop a product and sell it over here, we don't want to give it to player 1, we'd want to give it to player 2. So we sort of need to think of how we can sort of handle who owns what part of this tycoon. And we've sort of seen a mechanism for doing this already, which is attributes. And that is a good way of assigning these things to players. Each player that joins the game has this very interesting value called user ID. And this is a unique like number that is completely unique throughout the entirety of Roblox. So no two accounts have the same user ID. So this is really good because we can use this to identify an individual player and it will never ever have a duplicate. So if two people join and they have the exact same display name, they will still have a unique user ID. So this user ID is very important. And what we're going to do is we're going to assign it to the factory. So right now we kind of have this mechanism where everything is just sort of inside the workspace with no sort of container. What we want to do is sort of make everything that makes up one particular plot in our game into one cohesive sort of design, right? So you can choose all the things that are going to be part of our factory. We can right click and we could use a model or we could use a folder. I don't think it really matters. They're pretty much the same in terms of this concept. So we are going to pick I guess a model. That's fine. And we'll call this model the factory. But we already have something inside here that's called factory. So we'll just rename this as the floor, which is really what it is. So now we have a factory model. Maybe it should be a folder. Maybe we'll come back to it and change it. But we have this factory object, and inside it, it has a button, it has a dropper, it has a belt, it has a floor, and it has that seller icon. Now we can easily duplicate one of these, and we've got suddenly two factories. But how do we know who owns which one? Well, we can come down here and we can add an attribute, and we'll call it owner. So this is going to be the owner of the factory, and it's going to be a number because we're going to store into this owner attribute that unique ID we just talked about. So there we go. A factory has an owner. And now we can just get a reference to that factory and say workspace get what is it? First child? Find first child, isn't it? Find first child called factory, and then set the attribute called owner to be the player dot user ID. And so when I play the game now, if I was to look at that factory and I was to go down here into attributes, you'll see I've been given my own unique ID right there. So that's cool. You're obviously going to have a problem with this script later on, so we should mark that as a to-do. Assign the factory to each player, right? Right now, everything's going to, there's only one factory, and it's always going to be assigned to whoever the newest player is. We'll say assign a factory to each player. So we're going to come back to this later on when we have multiple factories, and we'll update who owns which one by looping through the list of factories and things like that. But for now, this is fine. So we can now go back to our seller because we need to give them some money. But who do we need to give money? Well, now we know each seller is going to be inside a factory, right? So our parent item will always have a owner attribute on it. So what we can do is say say seller, which is the seller that got hit right here, dot parent, get attribute owner, right? And this will give us the user ID of the person who owns this factory. And then from there, we can use the player service once again, but this time we're going to use the player service to get at that leader stats, right? So we need to get the player from a user ID. Let's see, how do we do that? Get player by user ID. Perfect, just what we need. And that will give us the player that owns this factory, right? And from there, if you remember, the player service is going to be, I don't think it shows in here unless you're playing the game, but it's basically that thing in the hierarchy that underneath had players in. And then for each player, you'll remember there was a leader stats folder. So we can sort of use this comment to update the money leader stat to have 100 more, or whatever value you sort of want to assign them. So here you go, leader stats. Find the first child called leader stats from our player. If it's found, which it should be, find the first child called money. And if that's found, then assign them some more money. Yay! We can sort of shortcut this a little bit because it looks nicer, but money.value plus equals 100. Should we see if that works? I think we should. So in theory, what's going to happen is I should have been assigned this factory as the owner. And I think we saw that last time. My user ID is down there on the owners. So now when I buy something and it drops onto this, that should look up my user ID and start assigning me money as it drops into there. And it's working perfectly. So now every time this falls onto there, we look up the leader stats and we add more money to it, which gives us a whole bunch of money. And now that means we can sort of spend that money on new buttons. So right now, this button does absolutely nothing, right? In terms of money. It says it costs $100, but it doesn't really. So now we need to think about how to make the buttons work with the money system, right? So let's quickly look at how to do that. Well, really, in our button touch thing, instead of showing the associated dropper straight away, we should be checking two things. One, that the person standing on the button is the owner of this factory. And two, that the button costs less than the amount of money that you have, right? So we should do that. And we can sort of do that quite easily the same way that we looked up the owner ID from here. We can do the same thing here. So we get the user ID from the button's parent, because remember, the parent will be the factory and the factory has an owner ID. We can use the player service to get a reference to that player. Like so. Player. And from there, we can check that they have enough money, which is very similar to this check here. So we'll just sort of copy this as well. A lot of copying. But we get the access to the leader stats. Then we find the money. And then we basically say, okay, if money.value is less than the cost, so we have to figure out the cost, then return early. But what is cost? Well, we can look up cost later on, but for now, we'll just say cost is 100. So if you have less money than 100, then quit early, which is what this return statement is doing. Right, so that's great for money, but it is not good for knowing who is touching this button. We need to check that the other part is the owner and not like the leg of someone else. So you need a mechanism for looking up if the other part, which is a base part, is part of a player. And I never remember how to do that. So let's see if Roblox Studio will be able to help us check if other part is a player. And it says we do that by using the player service, get player from character, and other part.parent. Yes, is supposed to be the character. And if it's not a player, return. And then we can check the owner, and then we can say if player is not equal to, oh, they both have the same name. So we're going to have to change one of these. That should be owner, I guess. Owner. And if the player is not equal to the owner, then return. And because they're the same, it doesn't really matter, but we'll change that to owner. So there you go. Check if the other part is a player's character. Okay, let's see if that works. So in theory, if I stand on this now, it's going to fail, right? Because one of two things has happened. Either I don't have enough money, which I don't, or before that, it's checked and I am not the owner of this button. So how do we know? How do we know if that's working? Well, we could use breakpoints once again. So if I go into my button script and I click right here, and then I stand on this, we're going to use that breakpoint to check to see what's happening. So the script has run, I've stood on the button, and it's hit my breakpoint here, which means it's paused the game, ready for me to take a look at the script line by line. So I'm going to press step over right now, but I'm going to press it on my keyboard, so you probably won't see me. Step over means run that line of code and move on to the next one. So now we're here. You see this little arrow? We're now executing this line of code next. So let's see what happens. If I press this button, it's going to look up the other part, which is some part of my leg, I guess. It's the right foot. You can see right there. And it's looked up the parent of that right foot. And the parent is my character, Bite Weasel. So now this call, get player from character, should have come back with a value, and it has. The value it's come back with is my player, Bite Weasel, right? And now if it's not a player, then we're going to return. It is a player, so we skipped over that. Next, it's going to say, okay, get the button's parent, which should be the factory, and it is, and get the owner attribute. And that user ID then should match my user ID. So if the player is not equal to the owner, then we could return, which we didn't because I am the owner. And so now it's checking the leader stats. Do we get leader stats from the owner, which is my character? Yes, we do. Do we get money? Yes, we do. Now, is the money value less than the cost? Yes, it is. I only have 0 money, but to buy this thing, I need 100 money. So it's going to quit early, which is why we're no longer buying the dropper. Make sense? Debugging scripts like this is really handy to understand what's going on step by step. And you can do that by using the step into button here or pressing F10 on your keyboard. And you can also use the step over and step out, and we'll probably see them at another point. But we can just continue now. And now we know why the button isn't doing anything, because I don't have enough money, which makes sense, but makes a problem for our tycoon. Because that button costs 100, I'm never going to be able to build it because I need to build it before I get any money. So let's sort of have now 2 buttons, and we can sort of see how this will work. We can duplicate this. We're going to have 2. And I want this button, the first one, to cost 0, and I want the second one to cost 100. So I've always been able to press a button to start making money to begin with. How can we do that? Well, let's use attributes again. We can use attributes, and we can call them this one on the button a cost. So now we're going to have an attribute of a cost. On that button, it's going to be 0. And on this button, the cost is going to be, let's say, 100. Cool. So now inside our button script, we can simply look up that variable as our cost. So button get attribute cost. And that is going to return our cost. We don't need to do it at the beginning because we can check that we are a player first. We can check that is the correct owner. Then we can look up the cost. A minor change there doesn't really matter. So there you go. And that's going to work great, but it's not going to look great because right now these droppers have the wrong values on them. And we could go in here and we could go into our billboard GUI and we can go into the cost and we could update this. or we could get our script to do it for us. So we know we're already looping through every single button we own, and we're sort of doing some stuff already. So let's just update our labels with the cost. So we can do that by saying, oh, it already has it right here. Neat, except it's not a service GUI. It is a billboard GUI. Actually, it's not on the base. So it's object.billboard GUI dot, and I don't think we called it text label. We called it cost, right? I think that's right. Let's go up here. Oh, we never added it to here. So in our type right at the beginning, remember when we made this, a button model is really a model and all these things. We can do the same thing inside each child. So the billboard GUI, we look at this, is a billboard GUI, and it has some children. The first child is cost, and the second child is title. Cost is a text label, and title is also a text label. So you can always update these models as things change. Sorry, these typings of your models as they change. And now you would get IntelliSense if you wrote in here. And that will sort of prove to us that we do have a billboard GUI, and we have a cost, and that cost has a text value, and that text value can be updated with a $sign and the cost. So now if we play, you should see that we have two buttons. The first one costs 0, and I should be able to stand on it and start making money. And if I stand on this one too early, I don't have enough money. But now, 100, can stand on it, and I have money. One problem is we don't actually spend money, right? It didn't actually cost 100 to stand on that. So up here, where we do all this stuff to get the money, we can also remove money. So else, which means if we have less money than it costs, quit early. Otherwise, just remove that cost. Makes sense? We can sort of update the cost of this second button to be a bit more so we can see it in action. Let's say it costs 300. We don't have to update any other labels because that's going to happen with our script. And now we've got two buttons. I can stand on this one to get some money. And we should see, once I've earned 300, I should be able to stand on this button, and this will go back down to 0 as we've spent that money. And there you go. We've built that one, gone back down to 0, but now we're getting money twice as fast because we have two droppers. Pretty straightforward, right? So what we've done in this video is basically assign a new script to this seller, and that seller is using the collection service to control all the sellers. And when something touches it, we make sure that the thing that touched it was a product. And then we found the owner of the factory and we assigned the money. In the button, we did something very similar. When a player stands on it, we make sure it is a player and not something else that's hit it. We make sure that it's the owner of the factory, and we make sure that they can afford it. And then we sort of change the money. And the one last thing we did is add a brand new script that controls players entering the game, assigning them some leader stats which show up on their leaderboard, and then making sure that they're assigned a, well, single factory that we have. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.